So my PICO question this semester is, in collegiate soccer players, will altering or reducing the playing time have an effect on the injury rates compared between positions? The method to do that would be to use the data that can be collected from heart rate monitors. So the physiological demands that can be identified through the use of heart rate monitors are activity profile, distance covered, exercise intensity, and energy systems and muscles that are involved. But for the sake of this presentation, I will be looking at just the exercise intensity that is collected from the heart rate monitors that were done in the studies I used for references in this presentation. So the reason that I chose this topic was because Longwood's women's soccer team uses first beat heart rate monitors, and I wanted to explore the different types of injuries and what would happen using the information from these heart rate. So if we look at the physiological demands per position, there were studies that showed that the defenders spent the most time at high intensity exercise, so in the 95 to 100% heart rate max, along with spending the most time in the low intensity exercise activity, so in the 70% of their heart rate max. So the defenders typically have like the highest number of intensity actions, so that shows up in the data as just sprints, and so they have more frequent sprints that they have to perform, but then they also have greater periods of recovery, which is where the low intensity comes into play. And so they have those longer rest periods throughout a match, but yet they also have more high intensity exercise. So they are mostly partaking in anaerobic exercise during a soccer match, whereas the midfielders are spending more time in their aerobic activity. So they spent more time in just the high intensity exercise, so in the 85 to 90% and the 90 to 95% range of their heart rate max. So this was more superior than the defenders and the forwards. So midfielders are typically engaged in both offensive and defensive play, so that can be why they have the higher intensity exercise activity, leading them to have more endurance that they are required to have. So midfielders, they show to be the most conditioned of the three sets of positions, because they have the higher amounts of jogging, signifying that they need to have the most endurance because they have the most aerobic activity. So they're more conditioned than both forwards and defenders, typically when it comes to endurance and aerobic activity. And then forwards demonstrated the most time spent in the low intensity exercise, and now we can think that from a tactical standpoint, forwards have to wait for a play to be set up prior to and executed prior to engaging in any high intensity activity. So they typically have more of their low levels of activity, more frequent rest periods of rest than midfielders and defenders do. So then if we look at the injury rates per position, forwards actually showed the highest incident rates at 3.85 injuries per athlete among the defenders, midfielders, and forwards. So they accounted for 42% of all injuries across positions. Excuse me. Midfielders accounted for the least amount of injuries among positions, and then defenders were in the middle. So it was found, there's just some additional information to kind of put the results of this into perspective. We found that in studies, it was found that hamstring strains were the most common among forwards and midfielders, while ligamentous injuries occurred most commonly in defenders. And so it was found that this was because of the fact that defenders, the high intensity exercise that they are partaking in is more of a reactive type of force, because they're usually having to react to the opposing team to make the defensive plays, whereas midfielders and forwards actually were found to have more muscle and tendinous injuries, so strains and tears from fast kicking and acceleration, deceleration activities. Since forwards have the highest injury rates, but they spend the most time in low intensity exercises, they are typically not as conditioned as midfielders and defenders. So just because of that, they're simply at greater risk of injury. Just simply because they're not as strong, they don't have the strength that they should, because they're not having to promote that high intensity exercise all the time. Given that they're already typically less conditioned than the other positions, reducing the playing time for them may not actually have an effect on their injury rates. It actually might increase their injury rates, because since you would be taking them from the lower amounts of activity that they are doing, and so to reduce that even more could predispose them to more injury. But then for your midfielders, since your midfielders have more aerobic activity, they're more conditioned. They have more stamina, more endurance. They're a lot stronger. So with their injury rates already being the lowest, and they're more conditioned than the other positions, reducing the playing time for them would definitely increase the risk of injury for them, because taking them out would reduce essentially the amounts of rest that they have, so the more intensity or low intensity exercise. So that would predispose them to injury by deconditioning them in a way, by reducing them through, because most of the activity in soccer players comes from matches rather than practices. And then your defenders, since they had the most time in the high intensity and the low intensity, reducing the playing time doesn't really have a direct effect on their injury rates, and since they already have those rest periods out on the field, taking them onto the sideline to have those rest periods would not really have any difference on their injury rates per position.